Player and coaching personnel moves to talk about at UCLA. We got Tony Siracusa of Last Word on College Football on the line to break it down for us. Tony, how we doing tonight?
Hey, Mark, how are you? Always good to spend some time with the voice of college football.
Here we are.
Exciting to be on your show.
7 games in the books. That's all that was played, but at least it was a successful season in regards to getting in the Pac-12 conference games, playing a championship game, and moving a few teams on to bowl play in Colorado and in Oregon. Now, in terms of UCLA, positive news and moves going into 2021 when we talk about guys that could have opted to go to the NFL draft and guys that are deciding to stay there in Westwood.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I think you and I spoke on National Signing Day, or the first night of that 3-week period, and it's interesting because UCLA after that night, I think we reported UCLA had a pretty mediocre recruiting class. You know, it wasn't horrible. Somewhere around the middle of the pack in the Pac-12, maybe mid 40s in the country. They signed a few big players in the days after that. But what is even bigger, and I know we can get to the new players in a second, but what is probably even bigger is UCLA had 4 grad transfers on the roster last year, all of whom played significant roles. Again, as significant as you can play when your team goes 3-4. Nonetheless, they were all starters, all played significant roles, and they have all opted to come back for a 6th year. Which speaks well of their thoughts on Chip Kelly and where the program is headed. So they got Obi Ebo, who had transferred from Stanford, defensive back. He's coming back. Quantrez Knight, who nobody argues was one of the real forces on defense, just a high-energy guy. The team likes to call him Q Knight just because Quantrez Knight is a mouthful. And he had come over from Akron, plays defensive back, nickel back, linebacker, a little bit of a hybrid. He's back. Britton Brown, the running back from Duke. This is big because, of course, they've lost Demetric Felton to the NFL draft. And Brown was the number 2 guy and really had a very, very productive year. And then Paul Gratton, the offensive lineman from Villanova, is coming back also. And what he brought to the table was some real senior leadership, experienced leadership on an offensive line that had lost some guys to graduation and some guys to transfer. So that is significant. And Brown, probably the most significant of them all. He was averaging just under 7 yards a carry last year. 550 yards and 4 touchdowns. And like I said before, Knight was the high energy guy on that defense that really had guys flying around the field. So really as significant as anything in the recruiting class, getting 4 grad transfers who all agree to stay for a 6th year is a big deal for Chip Kelly.
Yeah, you mentioned the contributions from Brown on the offensive side. Ebo, 19 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, and a sack. And Knight picked up 39 tackles, 4.5 tackles for loss. And again, abbreviated numbers because, of course, only 7 games played as opposed to the 12 or 13 if you get to postseason play. So that has to be taken into consideration. So, wow, you get all those guys back to make a run at 2021. And the transfer portal, how does that stand?
UCLA incoming is getting wide receiver Cam Brown from Texas A&M. He was a 4-star recruit. He's the son, by the way, of former Dallas Cowboys Super Bowl MVP Larry Brown. This is his son. Was a 4-star recruit. Never really saw the field under Jimbo Fisher. Only had about 7 catches over a couple of years. I've watched some film on him. He's got terrific body control. He's got really good footwork, is able to ditch defenders when they give him that little bit of a cushion. He's able to juke the defenders quite easily because he's got really good footwork. UCLA is pretty full in terms of the wide receiver position, but with a guy with this kind of talent, there's going to be some room for him in the lineup. So that is coming into UCLA, as well as Ethan Garbers, quarterback from the University of Washington, who was highly recruited out of Corona Del Mar down here in Newport Beach. He's 6'3", 220, a pro-style quarterback. And, it's interesting because UCLA got the backup quarterback from Washington 2 years ago in Colson Yankoff, and he's now a backup wide receiver. So it's kind of, now they're getting Garbers out of Washington, and who knows what his future is. But he's got 4 years to play at UCLA. He's got 4 years of eligibility left. So that's big. On the exiting side of things, in terms of the transfer portal, like you asked, tight end Evidence Njoku and his brother Charles, the wide receiver, are both leaving. Evidence was a tight end. He was a junior, white redshirt junior, transfer from Miami. Charles was a freshman, played in 3 games last season, really not an impact for either one of them. They entered the transfer portal together last week. Lanai Toailoa is transferring, the linebacker. Only played in 2 games last year. Interesting season. Only played in 2 games after being a key component the previous year. And then wide receiver Jalen Irwin is also transferring. Only 1 catch for 22 yards in the season opener in 2020 after having 32 receptions the previous year. Again, UCLA has a pretty big stockpile of wide receivers. So kind of hard to blame someone if they're not getting the catches, if they're not getting the targets, to go somewhere else, because it's a long list at UCLA. And then, as I mentioned before, they're losing Demetric Felton to the NFL. That's significant. He averaged just under 7 yards a carry, or Felton averaged about 6 yards a carry last year. But he was someone who went from the slot receiver position a couple of years ago when they had Joshua Kelly as the primary running back, turned himself into a full-time, full-service running back, and was really productive last year, 668 yards a game in about 5.5 games because he was injured at the end of the season. He's going to be a good 4th-round pick for somebody. He is serviceable. He runs hard, runs with his head down, doesn't go backwards on contact. A little bit better speed in the open field than what you saw out of Josh Kelly before then. So he's going to be serviceable. They're also losing Osa Odigizua to graduation to the NFL, the defensive lineman. So there's a couple holes to fill there, but it looks like, again, with the return of Britton Brown, and then with some of the guys that UCLA signed late in the recruiting period, they're going to be able to fill those holes.
3 of those players that you mentioned are early enrollees for a class that has risen now to 28th in the nation and 4th in the Pac-12, according to the 247 Sports Composite. And is there any other work that you expect to be done between now and the 2nd National Signing Day?
Yeah, a little bit, because, by my count, they're at 20 scholarships right now because they got these late signees, and a couple of them were big. They came, you and I spoke on that first day or first night of the early signing period, and it was a pretty mediocre class. Then they got, and this is going to kill me to have to pronounce this kid's name for 4 years, but Taioli Savea, 6'3", 265-pound defensive end from Desert Pines High School in Vegas, was a 4-star defensive end. Even as a 4-star, he's a little bit of a project. He needs to build out his frame a little bit, frankly, and work on his technique. But you can see the raw ability when you watch the tapes on this kid. He's got a motor that's always going, which obviously you want from a defensive end, and you can definitely see the raw ability there. And then they got Devin Kirkwood, who is a 6'3" athlete, as they list him, because he played defensive back and wide receiver at Sarah High School in Gardena down here in Southern California. Again, watched a lot of film on this kid. Fundamentally very sound, great footwork, terrific change of direction, and very good ball instincts. Very quick to the ball as a defensive back. My inclination is he's going to get his first shot at defensive back, even though he played both sides of the ball at Sarah, simply because, as we've talked about, UCLA's got such big numbers at the wide receiver position already. Their first need is defensive back between those two. But those two coming in on the Thursday and Friday of that early signing period. Huge gets for Chip Kelly, huge. And like you said, moved him up to number 4 in the conference and, mid-20s overall in the nation. So those are significant. So they got about 20 scholarships left. 5 scholarships left. They've signed about 20. I'm positive that they were not anticipating all 4 of the grad transfers to stay. Maybe 1 or 2. 4 is a surprise. It's a good surprise to have. It's a good problem to have. It means you got to kind of adjust your thinking going forward. I know that Chip had talked about on signing day he wanted to leave some open for the transfer portal. Maybe some late January, early February moves. By my count, there are over 200 players in the transfer portal right now. So there's a lot to choose from if you have someone in there who can fill a position of need. And then, like I said, you've got the next signing day coming in a couple of weeks on that first Wednesday in February. Not a lot of big targets left to be had for UCLA. They got the big targets they were aiming with those 2 4-star recruits. And so we'll see. But I would venture to guess with what's left, you're going to see moves out of the transfer portal for UCLA.
Yeah, it's a heavy class, of course, in California, but also Nevada. And they pulled a couple student athletes out of Alabama and Georgia as well. Tony Siracusa on the line from Last Word on College Football, breaking down UCLA. Some other coaching news as well.
Yeah.
Run down. Legacy.
Yeah. A legacy indeed. The wide receivers coach, Jimmy Doherty, left. He's joining the Arizona coaching staff as the quarterback's coach. Arizona, of course, fired Kevin Sumlin pretty quickly at the end of the season, and they hired Jed Fish, who was the UCLA offensive coordinator for a year and interim head coach when Jim Mora got fired. And so he's plugged Jimmy Doherty off UCLA's staff, and Doherty is going to be replaced by a very recognizable last name, Neuheisel. That would be Jerry Neuheisel, the son, of course, of Skippy, as they like to call him out here at UCLA, Rick Neuheisel. He looks like his dad. I swear he does. When I saw Rick Neuheisel play in the mid-'80s in the Rose Bowl, you look at Jerry now with the flowing blonde hair, spitting image. Jerry has been a graduate assistant at UCLA for a few years. He left for a year to go down to Texas A&M, work with Noel Mazzoni down there, came back to UCLA. He is now being rewarded with his first ever real full-time coaching position. He will be the receivers coach at UCLA. Of course, he was a former quarterback himself at UCLA, just like his dad. He was Brett Hundley's backup quarterback at UCLA. So he's got his first real full-time gig, and it's at his alma mater and his dad's alma mater. So quite the legacy story there.
Very cool. Very cool. UCLA keeping talent at home. Not much by way of the transfer portal, and those 6th-year eligibility guys coming back for an extra year at UCLA. So good news all around for Chip Kelly and company, coming off 3-4, which is still odd to say. Arizona State, my favorite record of the season, 1-2.
Right.
Herm Edwards and company. They were the pandemic champions of sorts in kind of a strange way, playing the least number of games in the Power 5.
Yeah, it was a strange season all around for the Pac-12 because they, of course, built themselves no wiggle room because they were the last ones to come back. There were no bye weeks to move games into. There was no juggling of schedules or shuffling of anything. You lost a game, the game's gone, and that's it. So it was definitely the strangest season ever in the Pac-12 conference, no question about it.
Although to date, a fairly quiet offseason as opposed to Big 12, Tom Herman leaving,
Sure.
Jim Harbaugh, the situation that went on for weeks and weeks and weeks before he re-signed at Michigan, upheaval in the SEC with now 4 firings in the
Right.
SEC, all over the place. And but in the Pac-12, things are quite calm at this point. Anything stand out to you in regards to what's happened over the last few weeks or what could transpire in the rest of the offseason until we get to a spring practice?
You know, the SEC is typical offseason, the storyline, because, you look at the staff at Alabama and you got assistant coaches going everywhere, and it takes a snap of the finger for Nick Saban to replace them. Not a problem whatsoever. out of all of the coaches, and I saw the statistic last night, and that was before the chaos, of course, with Jeremy Pruitt being fired at Tennessee today. Out of all the coaches that were at SEC media days prior to the 2019 season, only 5 of them are still with the teams that they were with back in 2019. I mean, it's chaos. And, I honestly thought going into the season, some coaches would get a little bit more wiggle room because of the pandemic, because of COVID, because of everything that they had to deal with trying to keep the rosters healthy and together. And boy, that has proven not to be the case at all. It's different in Tennessee because we're talking about NCAA rules violations. We're not talking about someone getting fired for their record. But in other places, the shuffle is just as big as it is any other year. COVID, no COVID. And of course, we have no idea what's coming around the corner this season, because we've got camps that are supposed to start to open in mid to late February. And again, I think that's going to be a case-by-case basis. I think the one thing we learned from this season, there's no Power 5 conference grouping. There's 5 conferences that tend to fend for themselves and do what they need to do for themselves and share some revenue at the end of the day. But it's definitely not a Power 5 in unity. It's 5 conferences that are powerful.
As you mentioned, Pruitt's firing, certainly to do with NCAA violations, in addition to not meeting expectations with a 3-7 record. But as soon as I draw the line there at the 5 that have maintained their jobs since the beginning of 2019, it's directly tied to winning.
Of course.
Alabama, LSU, Texas A&M, the 3 best teams in the West, they've retained their coaches. The 2 best teams in the East, Georgia, Florida, retained their coaches. Everybody else gone since the beginning of 2019. Wow. It's pretty stunning. But like you said, Tennessee is kind of the outlier right now, but everybody else, of course, it was due to the 1-loss record and not meeting expectations. I think that's a different thing than the 1-loss record, because in the SEC, as they like to say, it just means more. So the expectations are different than they are anywhere else in the Pac-12. Look, would Chip Kelly have survived in the SEC with 3 years, with the record he's got? Probably not, not even into school with lower expectations, like in Arkansas or Vanderbilt. Probably not. The Pac-12, it's a little bit of a different thing out there. Larry Scott held a press conference after the season and talked a lot about the revenue shortfalls for all the team and how the conference is going to help. And there is no way imaginable that the conference has the money to help bail out teams that have athletic departments with budget deficits. It's not even imaginable that the conference can help them. So it's like I said, it's a different operation in different parts of the country, depending upon which conference you're in right now. To me, you got to look at conferences like the AAC, who played most of their schedule, even with all the changes and everything else, and produced a team like Cincinnati that to me was one of the most fun teams to watch all year. And you do the transformation. If you put them in the Pac-12, Cincinnati probably would have owned the Pac-12, especially with that defense, the way it played. So it was definitely a strange season. And, we're really only a few weeks away from a lot of camps getting ready to open up again, depending upon whatever the circumstances are in each state. Tony Siracusa, last word on college football. Please head on over there, check out his work. Kevin McGuffey, Jason Ray, the whole crew over there covering college football every day, as we do right here as well. Tony, always appreciate the update. We will catch up with you soon.
Always glad to do it, Mark.